Financially troubled consumers could soon pay more for maize meal. This is after extreme heat has led to an almost 20% reduction in harvest this year. The food is a staple for around half of all the people living in sub-Saharan Africa. Let's discuss this now with Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa Chief Economist, Dr. Wandile Sihlobo. Dr. Sihlobo, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. Let's begin with just how devastating has this El Nino-induced drought been for the harvest season in South Africa?
I want to start off, Dolly, by correcting the things. I know in South Africa these things are sensitive. It's only Mr. Wandile Sihlobo. And thank you so very much for... These things get us into trouble in South Africa.
Agreed.
But on a more serious note now, which is at hand that we'll be talking about here, this El Nino is actually a challenge, not only for us here in South Africa, as you rightly point out, across the Southern Africa region. And you may recall that we started this season fairly well, where we had received some good rainfall across South Africa and across the region, to an extent that farmers actually planted more area in their agricultural activity this year compared to last year, all in the hope that the weather conditions will be more forgiving and the El Nino drought would come later on in the season. And things did start promising in that way up until the beginning of February, where it just became dry across the region throughout up until today, to an extent that in South Africa, we're now seeing a double-digit decline in a crop. You rightly point out on the figure to say, for all of our grains and the oilseeds, the figures we have so far suggest that the harvest could be down by roughly 20%. That's the issue for us. But if you think about Zambia, I think about half of their maize crop has also failed, and Zimbabwe is seeing also those double-digit declines. So this has been quite devastating for farmers and, of course, a worry for consumers as well.
How big an impact on consumers? Because prices, the understanding is that they will likely go up significantly.
So the challenge that we have, Dolly, is primarily on white maize supplies across the region. Because if you think about yellow maize, on yellow maize, we could easily get that from the world market. And the world prices on maize, they reasonably down now. But if you think about white maize, outside the Southern Africa region, the only country that produces white maize in large volume is Mexico. And I think now there is going to be constraint on the white maize supplies. As per to say how big of an impact on a consumer, the numbers we have now suggest that consumers in the coming months, in 2 to 3 months' time, for maize meal and the other products out of maize, we could see something that is plus 10% increase. Our friends at BFEP, for example, they're pointing out something between 10 to 12% over the next 3 months, and I think they are right. If prices remain at the levels that we are in. If then they continue to rise above the levels that we see today, you could see then those increases quite maintained at those higher levels. But if you look at other products that are in the food basket that the consumers go to shop for, like vegetables and meat, we're not worried a lot about that. We're worried primarily about the grain, which is a staple.
Yeah. Weather-related risks aside, Mr. Sihlobo, let's discuss what you say are aspects that policymakers and the private sector working collaboratively could unlock in order to realize long-term growth in the sector. Which aspects are those?
I think what we need to do in South Africa, because clearly, we've seen much progress in our agricultural sector, 1994 up until today. This is the sector that has more than doubled in value and in volume terms, but it is not operating at its full potential. And I think some of the things that we need to do as South Africa is to say, in the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, the land that is sitting in the state hands, for example, which is about 2.5 million hectares, can that be released with title deeds to carefully selected beneficiaries, and those beneficiaries be properly supported And I think that's the one aspect of growing the agricultural sector in the long run. And of course, I know the leadership there is already thinking about those things, the DG and the minister. The other aspects, they are outside that Department of Agriculture. Aspects around the logistics, road and the railway lines, they need improvement. At the ports, we need to improve the efficiency of the ports. As a country, we already export about half of what we produce in value terms. Last year, that was a record $13.2 billion. If then now we improve our agricultural production, we will need the export markets and we will need the ports that are operational. Crime and stock theft is a big thing in rural South Africa. That needs to be improved. And of course, positioning us well in the global environment in terms of geopolitics is something else that we need to be paying attention to. And lastly, animal diseases. The Department of Agriculture is looking into that, and I think with private sector, we need to intensify our focus there, because in our farming economy, half of the value is livestock and poultry, and we need to focus there because over the past few years, we've seen the high occurrence of these animal diseases. And I think with that, Dolly, we could be able to sustain and even expand the agricultural economy if we could focus on those things over the next couple of years, because as you rightly say, the weather is a near-term challenge, and we still have it tomorrow, and we still have a sector to grow and the jobs to create.
But you also leave a big question mark in all of what you have just mentioned, specifically related to policy matters, because you say there are elections coming up, and it remains to be seen just how seriously policymakers are going to take these issues. Is that a big worry for you?
That is a big worry, Tony, because of course, with the elections and the uncertainty on what we are seeing coming out of the polls, that's something that as agricultural participants, and certainly on our side as Agricultural Business Chamber, we are thinking about. But I do think that the Director General at the Department of Agriculture can take a step forward by asserting the aspirations of the master plan to the industry and say the agriculture and the agro-processing master plan that was launched by the government in May 2022 could still be a blueprint to drive our sector forward, regardless of what happens in the outcomes of the elections. And in conversations that I've had with the leadership there at the department, that's certainly something that the DG is looking at. And I think that if you can do that, then that brings a bit of comfort to the sector, because there is a worry that I'm sensing in various meetings that when we meet with our members across the country, we hear people asking those questions.
Wandile Sihlobo, let's leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. He is a chief economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber.